What if I told you that our modern idea of alien contact, the friendly, human-looking visitors from other planets, didn't really start in Hollywood? What if it all goes back to one single, incredibly controversial book from 1953? Well, that's what we're diving into today. Flying Saucers Have Landed, a book so powerful, it didn't just tell a story, it kicked off an entire movement.
And just to set the stage here, you really have to get what was at stake. A newspaper review at the time put it perfectly. There was zero middle ground. This book was either a completely world-changing, history-making revelation, or it was a gigantic hoax. That's it. Those were the options.
So what on earth made this book so explosive? Well, it's because it's not just one story. It's actually two incredible and very different stories packed into one cover, coming from two different authors.
And this is such a fascinating setup, right? On one hand, you've got Desmond Leslie, playing the part of the historian. He's making this wild case that flying saucers are nothing new. And then you have George Adamski, the witness, who comes in with this jaw-dropping claim that he actually met one of the pilots. So let's start with Leslie's big historical theory first.
Okay, so Leslie's half of the book is this massive deep dive into history with a truly radical idea. These things we call flying saucers, they've been coming here for thousands of years. And the proof, he says, is hiding in plain sight, right inside our oldest myths and religious texts.
For example, he points to ancient Sanskrit epics from India, which talk about these incredible flying machines called Vimanas. Now, Leslie's argument is that these weren't just poems or metaphors. He believed they were literal descriptions of real, flying vehicles, like celestial cars from some lost, high-tech civilization.
And the power source? Get this. Leslie brings up this concept called vril. It's described as a kind of personal energy, a mastery over vibrations that could let a person literally overcome gravity. So think less about rocket fuel and more about pure levitation.
And what's so interesting here is how Leslie basically uses this to critique modern science. He draws this line in the sand between what he calls ancient subtle control, using things like sound and consciousness to move huge stones, and our modern obsession with brute force, loud engines and nuclear bombs.
He even pulls out quotes like this one from ancient texts that he claims are basically technical manuals. I mean, when you read about Mercury and a driving whirlwind, it sounds suspiciously like some kind of advanced propulsion system, right? This whole historical argument really sets the stage perfectly for the book's second act.
All right, so if Leslie's part was the warm-up act, then George Adamski's story, that's the headliner. This is where the book shifts gears from a fascinating theory into a direct, first-person testimony of contact.
Adamski gives this incredibly precise, almost minute-by-minute account of November 20th, 1952. He and his friends, they weren't just lost in the California desert, they actually went there hoping to see something. But what he claims they got was way, way more than they ever bargained for.
And this quote, this just perfectly captures that moment of pure shock. The small ship lands, a figure gets out, and as Adamski walks closer, it hits him. It really sinks in. This wasn't just some remote-controlled drone. He was face-to-face with a person, a human being from another world.
The description Adamski gives is so specific. He really stresses how human the being looked, pleasant, beautiful even, with long, sandy hair. There was nothing scary or monstrous about him, which, you have to remember, for the 1950s, the era of bug-eyed monsters was a totally radical idea.
And the clothes were just as strange. He talks about this seamless one-piece suit made of a shimmering material. No buttons, no zippers, no visible way of getting in or out of it. Every little detail just screams a level of technology that was completely unheard of on Earth at the time.
But okay, this wasn't just some passive sighting from afar. No way. Adamski claims they actually communicated, that this visitor had a very specific, very urgent message for all of us, and that he even left behind some physical proof.
So, since they couldn't speak the same language, Adamski says they communicated with a mix of hand gestures and, well, telepathy. And the message itself was a pretty heavy one. The other people out there in the universe were getting really worried about us, specifically about our new obsession with atomic bombs and the dangerous path we were headed down.
Now, to prove this wasn't all just a desert hallucination, Adamski offered up what he called proof. The first piece of evidence? Footprints. He said the visitor intentionally pressed his shoes deep into the sand, and his friends, who saw the whole thing from a distance, came over later and made plaster casts of these very strange prints.
And the second piece of proof was even weirder. Adamski says he handed the visitor a blank photographic plate. A little while later, the visitor handed it back, and it wasn't blank anymore. It now had this really intricate image on it, full of strange symbols that people are supposedly still trying to figure out.
So what happens when you take Leslie's ancient history and you mash it together with Adamski's modern-day encounter in one book? Well, the result was a cultural earthquake. It changed everything.
This book pretty much single-handedly created the modern contactee movement. See, before Adamski, UFOs were just these cold, distant lights in the sky. But after this book, the whole story changed. Suddenly, it was all about personal, meaningful contact with these wise, human-like space brothers who were here to help us.
And that was really Adamski's ultimate takeaway. His message wasn't one of fear or invasion. It was a plea for us to be open-minded, to be friendly. He was basically saying, hey, these guys are already here walking among us, and we should welcome them.
So in the end, it doesn't really matter if you think this is the greatest story ever or the gigantic hoax that newspaper warned about. The book's power and its influence are just undeniable. And it makes you wonder, right? Forces us to ask ourselves this really fundamental question. Why do we want to believe these stories of contact so badly? What is it about visitors from the stars that speaks to us on such a deep level?